Hi, my name is Janine Kong, and I did my Criminal Justice 330 project on environmental racism. So I want to start off by defining environmental racism, which is the disproportionate exposure of minority communities, typically low-income Black communities, to environmental hazards and pollution. Some examples include close proximity to toxic waste facilities, garbage dumps, and pollution of the air, water, and soil. And this also includes disproportionate vulnerability to natural disasters. This quote is from Todd S. Kim, who is the Assistant Attorney General of the Justice Department's Environment and Natural Resources Division. And it says, in America, your zip code is often a key determinant of your cancer risk and even your expected lifespan. And this implies that not only do low-income minority neighborhoods receive significantly more exposure to hazards and pollution as opposed to their white and wealthier counterparts, but they also suffer extreme health effects from this constant exposure. So the first cause of environmental racism is redlining, which is a historical discriminatory practice that denied financial services like loans and insurance to neighborhoods deemed hazardous or financially risky. But in actuality, this practice would target lower income, minority, and immigrant residents. Neighborhoods were color coded and given grades, with A being the best and D being the most hazardous and colored in red. Historical redlining is not the sole cause of environmental racism, but it did lay the foundation for environmental injustice related issues today. So 71% of previously redlined areas are low to middle income areas today, and almost 2/3 of previously redlined areas are minority areas today. Now, in terms of heat today in cities like Baltimore, Dallas, Denver, Miami, Portland, and New York, poorer neighborhoods with more residents of color can be 5 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit hotter during the summer than wealthier, whiter parts of these cities. This is due to the lack of green space, which means trees and parks, and air conditioning in these low-income areas, as well as the abundance of paved concrete, which absorbs and traps heat. These factors lead to high rates of heat-related ambulance calls. In addition to this, city planners also looked at these redline areas as cheap land suitable for the building of new highways, industries, and warehouses, which all of these increase air pollution. Nitrogen dioxide is a gas associated with industrial facilities and vehicle exhaust, and nitrogen dioxide pollution can lead to asthma, inflamed airways, heart attacks, strokes, and lung cancer. In terms of this gas, pollution levels were higher in 80% of redline neighborhoods that were given D grades and lower in 84% of neighborhoods that were given A grades. This trend held true regardless of whether it was a big city or a small town. A different study found that D-grade neighborhoods on average experience 50% more nitrogen dioxide pollution than the A-grade neighborhoods. Most of these areas that were previously redlined are still disadvantaged today due to the continuous lack of investment in these same areas. So the main issue that continues to fuel environmental racism today is institutional racism, which in this case means racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, the enforcement of regulations and laws, and the locations of landfills and toxic waste disposal. So firstly, I will talk about a case of environmental racism in Uniontown, Alabama, a town with a population that is about 90% Black. In 2007, the Perry County Commissioners approved plans of the Alabama Department of Environmental Management to permit the Arrowhead landfill in Uniontown, despite residents showing their disapproval by forming coalitions and signing petitions. The landfill was also authorized to receive waste from communities in 33 different states. In December 2008, over 1 billion gallons of toxic coal ash burst from an impoundment and spilled into the Emory River in Kingston, Tennessee, which covered about 300 acres. Coal ash contains pollutants like arsenic, lead, and mercury that can affect people's lungs. And 10 years later, the workers who cleaned up the coal ash are still suffering the effects from exposure, including brain cancer, lung cancer, and leukemia. Then, in 2010, with the approval of the County Commission, the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, and even the Environmental Protection Agency, the Tennessee Valley Authority transported 4 million cubic yards of coal ash from the Kingston site to the Arrowhead landfill in Uniontown. The Kingston cleanup was regulated under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, which considered the coal ash hazardous in Tennessee, but after it was transported to Uniontown, it was classified as non-hazardous under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. So by this point, Uniontown residents had filed many complaints with the ADEM since the opening of the Arrowhead landfill in 2007. But in 2013, 35 residents who lived a mile from the landfill complained to the EPA's External Civil Rights Compliance Office, alleging that the ADEM's decision to give authorization to the Arrowhead landfill violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits federally funded jurisdictions from discriminating based on race, color, or national origin. The complaint described impacts like emissions of odors, a high volume of noise, dizziness, nausea, and irritation of the nose, throat, and eyes. For the next 5 years, those residents continued to send in more letters, photos, studies, inspection reports, and other evidence documenting the impacts. Then in 2018, the EPA's Civil Rights Office dismissed the residents' complaint and claimed that there was insufficient evidence. To evaluate the effect of the landfill on air quality, the EPA depended on data from an air monitor that was miles away from Uniontown, which was essentially irrelevant to the residents on the front line of the issue. Additionally, the EPA also refused to carry out testing and monitoring, and they also refused to consider the effects on property value. And their only explanation for this was that they have the discretion to decide the types of harms that require investigatory resources. So to go back in time a few years, in 2015, an investigation by the Center for Public Integrity found that over the course of more than 20 years, the EPA received hundreds of complaints about alleged violations of Title VI, and the EPA's Civil Rights Office did not make a single discovery of discrimination until Barack Obama took office in 2009. After he came into office, the EPA's Civil Rights Office only made 2 formal findings of discrimination. So the next case of environmental racism took place in Houston, Texas, which happened just last month. So the Department of Justice opened an investigation after learning about reports of illegal dumping in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods of Houston, as well as the city's failure to respond to these reports. So these reports, similar to those of Uniontown, potentially characterize a possible violation of Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The Department of Justice is also investigating the allegation that 11 out of 13 of Houston's city-owned landfills and incinerators are located in predominantly Black neighborhoods. And this may also be part of the violation of Title VI. Residents in certain communities have repeatedly expressed their concerns about the dumping of furniture, tires, medical waste, automated bank teller machines, dead animals, and even human bodies. Residents also reported more than 200 tires in a space about the size of a football field. And Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark said that the possible outcomes of illegal dumping include attracting rodents and mosquitoes, causing illness, lowering property values, blocking sewer drainage, and contaminating drinking water. Now, the final case of environmental racism I'm going to talk about happened in Flint, Michigan, which is a majority Black city with 40% in poverty. So this started out with Flint in a financial crisis. So city and state officials decided to change their water supply in order to save money. So they originally obtained their water from the Detroit River through the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, but Detroit's system became too expensive, so Flint officials decided to build its own pipeline to obtain water from Lake Huron, which would save millions of dollars during the next decade. The thing is that the construction of the new pipeline would take 2 years, so Flint's temporary solution would be to obtain its water from the Flint River. Now, the question to ask is, why not just use Flint River in the first place? If it's a safe and acceptable temporary solution, then why can't it work as Flint's permanent solution? So the answer to that question is citizens of Flint knew how polluted the Flint River was and that it is the accumulation site of industrial waste, particularly from factories like General Motors. So before I continue discussing Flint's water crisis, I wanted to visually depict the crisis. Here, there are two different nails after a month of exposure to water. The only difference between the two is that the top nail was exposed to Detroit water and the bottom one was exposed to Flint River water. And both nails were rinsed with water before the picture was taken. This next picture shows water samples taken from a home in Flint. All the samples were taken in 2015. So the two bottles on the left were taken on January 15th. The second bottle from the right was taken on January 16th, and the one on the far right was taken on January 21st. So residents quickly grew concerned, and General Motors facilities even complained that the corrosiveness of the water caused their engine parts to rust, but even this was still not enough for officials to intervene. In fact, they responded by arguing that they were pumping water from the upstream portion of the river, which they claimed was cleaner. Moreover, they did not implement any anti-corrosive measures. In addition to industrial contamination, lead from the deteriorating pipes was leaching into the water. A test done by Virginia Tech researchers found that lead levels reached 13,200 parts per billion, while water is considered hazardous waste at only 5,000 parts per billion. rashes, hair loss, burning eyes, lead poisoning, and Legionnaire's disease, which is an abnormal form of pneumonia, were some of the common health effects experienced among citizens. So all of these outcomes were still not enough to convince officials to step in, and they made many different excuses, like they denied there being a serious problem, and they told residents that the water is fine, and they reassured residents that their concerns will go away by the time the new water system is done being built. Michigan's governor sent out 274 pages of emails regarding Flint's water crisis, but he did not address the topic of race once. Instead, he directed attention to the city's water supply costs, questions about scientific data on lead contamination, and uncertainty about the responsibilities of health officials. The emails did not mention race, but they did attribute the issues to politics. In fact, one community representative even noted that Michigan's environmental regulators believe that the Flint activists were trying to turn the topic of lead exposure into, quote unquote, a political football. So, in terms of this issue at a federal level, officials and agencies must be willing to enforce environmental and civil rights laws. And they must be proactive in pinpointing issues rather than just reacting to citizens' complaints. Environmental laws also must be enforced equally in communities of color and low-income communities. And then officials and agencies in power must be held accountable for any unethical actions, as well as any lack of action. The Department of Justice could potentially take on this role. And then finally, we as individuals must speak up about cases like these in order to raise awareness about environmental racism. If we constantly amplify this issue, we can bring attention to it at local, state, and federal levels. We must make it known that racial equity is intertwined with climate equity. And here are my references.